My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I speak these words as the president of Burkina Faso, but first as a man shaped by faith, memory, and responsibility. I am a Christian not because it grants me comfort or status, but because it demands truth from me when silence would be easier. My faith was not inherited through ease. It was tested in villages where prayer was whispered, not sung. It was strengthened by elders who believed, even when belief cost them everything. It was refined by the sight of children who learned fear before they learned scripture. I do not speak today to accuse, to campaign, or to perform morality. I speak because what I have seen no longer allows me the luxury of quiet. I speak because leadership, when it is honest, must sometimes confess before it commands. Africa is not a headline to me. It is not a statistic. It is a living wound and a living hope. In Burkina Faso and across the Sahel, faith is no longer an abstract idea. It is measured in burned churches, emptied villages, broken families, and unmarked graves. Yet what troubles me even more than the violence is the forgetting. Forgetting by those with power, forgetting by those with pulpits, forgetting by those who pray safely while others bleed quietly. I address Christians, Muslims, African leaders, and the wider world not as enemies or rivals, but as witnesses who will one day answer for what we chose to see and what we chose to ignore. I do not claim moral superiority, I claim moral urgency. What I am about to share are 6 warnings. They are not predictions, they are not threats. They are reflections born from watching faith tested under fire. They are meant to awaken, not to frighten. If we still believe that faith must lead to justice, then we must listen while there is still time. I must begin with the warning that weighs heaviest on my conscience: the quiet forgetting of persecuted Christians in Africa. I have walked through villages where the church bell no longer rings, not because faith has died, but because those who rang it were killed or forced to flee. I have listened to mothers who no longer ask when their husbands will return, because they already know the answer. I have prayed beside men whose only crime was refusing to renounce Christ when threatened with a weapon and a choice. These people are not symbols, they are not useful stories, they are not instruments of ideology. They are believers whose names will never appear in international speeches, yet whose blood has soaked the soil of this continent. What frightens me is not only the cruelty of those who attack them. Cruelty has always existed. What frightens me is how easily the world has learned to look away. In many parts of Africa, Christians wake each morning unsure whether they will still have a home by nightfall. Churches are burned not during war, but during prayer. Entire communities are erased quietly, without cameras, without outrage, without consequence. And yet the global church often responds with silence that is polite, theological, and tragically distant. I say this with humility and sorrow. When suffering becomes familiar, compassion weakens. When persecution happens far away, it becomes easier to spiritualize it instead of confronting it. We say we are praying, but we do not ask what prayer demands of us. I have heard Christians in safe nations speak passionately about faith under threat, while knowing little about the believers being hunted in Africa. I have heard sermons about courage that never mention the courage of those who refuse to abandon Christ, even when abandonment would mean survival. This forgetting is not neutral, it is not harmless, it carries moral weight. When one part of the body suffers and the rest feels nothing, the problem is not distance, the problem is numbness. I am not asking for guilt. Guilt changes nothing. I am asking for memory. Memory is the beginning of responsibility. The persecuted Christians of Africa are not asking to be saved by foreign powers. They are asking not to be erased from conscience. They are asking that their lives matter as much as their beliefs. They are asking that their deaths not be treated as background noise to global comfort. I have met pastors who bury their congregations one by one, yet still preach forgiveness. I have met families who flee with nothing but scripture memorized because books were burned. I have met young people who know the cost of discipleship more intimately than many theologians ever will. And yet they are absent from global conversation. This absence teaches a dangerous lesson. It tells the persecuted that their suffering is acceptable. It tells the violent that their actions carry no consequence. And it tells the comfortable that faith without risk is sufficient. Christ was not crucified quietly so that his followers could forget those who suffer for his name. I say this not to condemn but to awaken. Forgetting is a choice, silence is a decision, and every decision shapes the future of the church. If we allow persecuted Christians in Africa to disappear from our moral imagination, we are not protecting peace. We are training ourselves to live with injustice. Faith that survives only where it is safe is not faith, it is convenience. I ask Christians in every nation to remember that the church did not begin in safety. It was born under threat. It grew through sacrifice. It spread through witness that did not depend on protection. Africa today carries that witness again, not by choice but by circumstance. And the question before the global church is simple and terrifying. Will we recognize it, or will we abandon it to history? If the answer is silence, then the blood of forgotten believers will not only stain the ground of Africa, it will echo in the conscience of a church that chose comfort over communion. This is my first warning. It is not dramatic, it is not political, it is simply true. Remember them while there is still time. My second warning concerns something more subtle than persecution, yet just as destructive: the distortion of faith through violence and extremism. I have watched faith be weaponized in ways that leave scars deeper than bullets. I have seen sacred words twisted until they no longer heal but divide. I have listened to men claim divine authority while committing acts that no merciful God could bless. And I have felt the weight of knowing that once faith is used to justify cruelty, its credibility collapses in the eyes of the wounded. This distortion does not belong to one religion. It is not owned by one ideology. It is a temptation that appears wherever fear, power, and desperation meet belief. In parts of Africa, violence now wears the mask of righteousness. And when that happens, the innocent suffer twice, first by the act itself, and then by the confusion it leaves behind. When faith is fused with brutality, the message of love becomes unrecognizable. Communities begin to fear religion instead of being healed by it. Children grow up associating prayer with danger, and the name of God, spoken in whispers of hope, becomes associated with terror. I say this as a Christian, but also as a leader responsible for a nation of many beliefs. When violence claims divine permission, it poisons the spiritual soil for everyone. It creates a world where faith is no longer a refuge, but a threat. The tragedy is that extremists do not only kill bodies, they deform meaning. They take ancient traditions of mercy, patience, and humility, and hollow them out until only slogans remain. What is left is not faith, but domination disguised as devotion. I have spoken with Muslims who weep because their religion is being hijacked by men who preach hatred instead of submission to God. I have spoken with Christians who struggle to explain their faith to their children because violence has made belief seem dangerous or irrational. I have spoken with young people who no longer ask which religion is true, but which one will hurt them least. This is the silent victory of extremism. It does not need to conquer territory, it only needs to corrupt trust. When the world sees faith only through the lens of violence, it stops listening to its moral voice. It stops believing that religion can guide conscience, restrain power, or protect the vulnerable. And when that happens, faith is pushed out of the public soul entirely, replaced by cynicism or rage. This distortion thrives when moderate voices withdraw, when religious leaders choose safety over clarity, when governments fear confrontation more than corruption, when communities remain silent rather than risking misunderstanding. I must say something difficult, especially to believers. Silence in the face of religious violence is not neutrality, it is permission. Every time we fail to name brutality as a betrayal of faith, we allow it to claim legitimacy. Every time we excuse extremism as cultural or inevitable, we surrender moral ground. Every time we say nothing because the victims are far away, we weaken the meaning of belief everywhere. Faith, in its truest form, restrains violence. It disciplines power. It reminds the strong that they are accountable. Any movement that celebrates cruelty while claiming divine approval has already abandoned God, even if it shouts his name. I do not believe that religion is the problem. I believe its corruption is. And corruption flourishes where there is fear, to speak plainly. Africa today is paying the price for this distortion, but it will not remain contained here. When faith is disfigured in one place, the wound spreads. Distrust travels faster than truth. And soon, people everywhere begin to associate God with danger instead of dignity. This should concern every believer, regardless of tradition. Because once faith loses its moral authority, it cannot defend the poor, the weak, or the persecuted. It becomes a banner for power instead of a shelter for the broken. The responsibility to resist this distortion does not belong only to governments or scholars. It belongs to parents, pastors, imams, elders, and ordinary believers. It begins with refusing to excuse violence in our own communities. It continues with teaching the young that faith demands restraint, not domination. We must recover the courage to say that not everything done in God's name honors God. We must protect the sacred from those who exploit it for control. And we must do so not with hatred, but with clarity. If we fail, the world will not reject extremism alone. It will reject faith itself. This is my second warning. Faith that blesses violence ceases to be faith. It becomes a tool of destruction. And once faith becomes a weapon, no one remains safe. My third warning is born from a truth that is uncomfortable to admit. Poverty is being used to bargain with the human soul. In many parts of Africa, faith is no longer challenged only by violence. It is challenged by hunger. It is tested not just by fear, but by desperation. I have stood in places where people are not asking theological questions. They are asking how to survive the next day. When a man has not eaten, when a mother cannot feed her children, when a young person sees no future beyond war and dust, faith becomes fragile, not because it is weak, but because the human body has limits. And it is precisely at this breaking point that evil becomes strategic. I have seen armed groups offer bread in exchange for loyalty. I have seen young men told that joining extremism is the only way to be protected, paid, or respected. I have seen families pressured to abandon their faith not through argument, but through starvation. When belief must compete with survival, the moral failure is not the choice of the desperate, it is the failure of the world that allowed such a choice to exist. Let us speak honestly. When people are forced to choose between God and food, something has already gone terribly wrong. No ideology, no religion, no political system has the right to corner the soul in this way. Poverty does not only empty stomachs, it empties options. It strips people of dignity until they become vulnerable to manipulation, and those who exploit this vulnerability know exactly what they are doing. They do not need to convince people that their beliefs are true. They only need to convince them that hunger is worse than compromise. This is not conversion, it is coercion. Faith that is abandoned under threat of starvation is not faith lost. It is faith betrayed by a world that refused to protect the poor. And every time we ignore this reality, we quietly accept a form of spiritual violence that leaves no visible wounds but destroys lives just the same. I speak to Christians who live in abundance and to leaders who manage great resources. Charity is not enough. Occasional aid is not enough. The poor do not need to be pitied. They need to be defended from systems that profit from their desperation. When poverty is allowed to persist, extremism finds fertile ground. When education is absent, lies spread easily. When hope is denied, violence becomes persuasive. This is not a mystery. It is a pattern we have seen repeated across history. Africa's suffering is often described as inevitable. I reject that lie. Hunger is not fate. Illiteracy is not destiny. Despair is not natural. They are the result of decisions made far from the villages that endure their consequences. I have watched young people drift away from faith not because they rejected God, but because God seems silent in the face of their pain. When faith is preached without justice, it sounds hollow. When prayer is offered without protection, it feels distant. And when the church is absent from the realities of survival, its message loses weight. This is why poverty is not just an economic issue, it is a spiritual battlefield. Whoever feeds the hungry shapes their future. Whoever educates the young influences their conscience. Whoever stands beside the poor earns their trust. If the church does not stand there, others will, and they will not come with mercy. I say this with urgency. Neglecting the material needs of Africa is not a neutral act. It is an invitation for extremism to fill the void. It is a surrender of the next generation to those who understand that desperation is the most powerful recruiting tool. Faith must never be offered as an alternative to bread. It must walk beside it. The gospel was never meant to starve the body while saving the soul. Christ fed the hungry before he taught them. He healed before he preached. He understood that dignity is restored through care, not coercion. If we truly believe that every soul matters, then we must also believe that every life deserves the conditions to choose freely. Faith chosen under threat is not faith, it is survival. This is my third warning. When poverty is weaponized, faith becomes collateral damage. And the silence of the comfortable makes them complicit in a crime that leaves no courtroom but condemns generations. My fourth warning concerns the most fragile and most decisive reality of all, the spiritual disorientation of Africa's youth. When I look at the future of this continent, I do not see borders or resources first. I see young faces. I see boys and girls growing up surrounded by violence, corruption, and broken promises. I see a generation being shaped not by wisdom but by survival instincts. And I fear what happens when youth inherit a world that has offered them no moral compass. Many young Africans today have never known stability. They were born into conflict, educated by fear, and taught early that power belongs to those who take it by force. For them, faith is not rejected out of rebellion, it is often abandoned out of confusion. They ask questions that are rarely answered honestly. Where was God when my village burned? Why do leaders speak of peace while stealing our future? Why does faith seem powerless against injustice? When these questions meet silence, something fills the space. And what fills it is rarely good. I have spoken with young men who joined violent groups not because they believed their ideology, but because they needed belonging. I have spoken with young women who no longer pray because prayer seemed to change nothing. I have spoken with students who associate religion not with hope, but with hypocrisy, because those who spoke loudest about God lived farthest from his values. This is not a failure of youth, it is a failure of presence. When the church withdraws from education, from moral formation, from the daily struggles of the young, others step in. Extremists offer certainty. Criminal networks offer income. Corrupt elites offer cynicism. Each of them provides something the young are desperate for: identity. A generation without spiritual grounding becomes easy to manipulate. Without truth, lies feel strong. Without hope, anger feels purposeful. Without guidance, violence feels like destiny. I say this carefully because it is painful to admit. Many young Africans do not reject God. They reject the version of faith they see practiced without courage. They reject sermons that ignore injustice. They reject leaders who speak of morality while living in excess. They reject silence dressed up as wisdom. Faith must be lived to be believed. And the young see everything. If we fail to meet them where they are, we should not be surprised when they listen to voices that promise power instead of patience. If we do not invest in their education, others will invest in their radicalization. If we do not offer them purpose rooted in dignity, they will accept purpose rooted in destruction. This is why schools matter. This is why mentorship matters. This is why moral leadership matters. Not as control, but as companionship. Not as indoctrination, but as truth lived visibly. Africa's youth are not lost. They are waiting. Waiting to see whether faith has relevance beyond words. Waiting to see whether leaders will sacrifice for them, not just speak to them. Waiting to see whether God's love can be embodied in justice, honesty, and protection. If that waiting turns into abandonment, the consequences will not remain local. A generation shaped by despair does not stay contained within borders. Its anger travels, its wounds echo, its choices reshape the world. The future of Africa will be decided less by elections than by whether the young are given something worth believing in. This is my fourth warning. A spiritually abandoned generation does not remain neutral. It is claimed by whatever force arrives first with conviction. If faith does not guide them, something else will. My fifth warning is perhaps the most difficult to speak, because it requires honesty from those who believe themselves innocent. It is the warning about the indifference of global Christianity. I say this not with anger but with grief. I have prayed in churches that are protected by walls, laws, and comfort. I have watched congregations gather without fear, sing without whispers, and leave without wondering whether they will be followed home. These are blessings, but blessings become dangerous when they dull our awareness of others. Across Africa, Christians are crying out, not always loudly, often quietly. They cry out from displacement camps, from forests where they hide at night, from communities erased from maps, and yet many of their brothers and sisters across the world barely hear them. Indifference rarely announces itself as cruelty. It disguises itself as distance, fatigue, and distraction. We tell ourselves that the problem is complex, that we have done what we can, that prayer is enough. But there is a difference between prayer that leads to action and prayer that excuses inaction. I must speak plainly. Safe faith can become complacent faith, and complacency slowly erodes responsibility. I have listened to global discussions about persecution where Africa is mentioned briefly, almost apologetically, before the conversation moves on. I have seen reports filed, statements issued, and conferences held while villages continue to burn. Words accumulate, lives disappear. This indifference does not come from hatred, it comes from hierarchy. From the unspoken belief that some lives are more urgent than others, that suffering in distant lands is tragic but tolerable, that faith under fire is unfortunate but not central. But faith does not recognize borders. Pain does not ask for passports. And conscience does not excuse selective compassion. When Christians in Africa are killed, the church is wounded. When their suffering is ignored, the wound festers. Indifference trains the heart to accept injustice as normal. And once injustice becomes normal somewhere, it eventually becomes acceptable everywhere. I do not ask Christians in wealthy nations to save Africa. Africa does not need saviors. It needs solidarity. It needs voices that refuse to let suffering be forgotten. It needs leaders who speak truth, even when it is inconvenient. It needs believers who understand that faith is not proven by comfort, but by commitment. Silence sends a message. It tells persecutors that their actions carry no moral cost. It tells victims that they are alone. And it tells the next generation that faith can coexist peacefully with abandonment. That message is false. And it is dangerous. I have met African Christians who forgive their attackers, but still ask one question: does the world know we exist? Does anyone remember us? Are we truly part of the same body? When indifference answers those questions, it answers them cruelly. This is not a call to despair, it is a call to awaken empathy before regret sets in. History does not judge faith by how loudly it speaks when it is safe, but by how faithfully it stands when others are threatened. If global Christianity continues to look away, it will not only lose moral authority, it will lose credibility with those who suffer most. This is my fifth warning. Indifference today becomes shame tomorrow, and shame, once earned, is difficult to erase. My sixth warning is the one that most people misunderstand and therefore underestimate. Africa is not only a victim of history, it is a spiritual front line of our time. What is happening across this continent is not isolated, it is not accidental, and it is not contained. Africa today reflects a struggle that the entire world is quietly entering, whether it admits it or not. I say this carefully, without drama and without prophecy. When faith collapses under pressure in one place, the consequences do not remain there. When violence, greed, and indifference are allowed to redefine what is normal, that definition travels. And Africa is where many of these forces are now testing their strength. Here, faith is being stripped down to its core, not by philosophy, but by fire. Not by debate, but by survival. In such conditions, belief either becomes real or it disappears. There is no space for performance, no reward for empty words, no protection for convenience. That is why Africa matters spiritually. I have seen believers who possess nothing yet refuse to hate. I have seen communities shattered by terror still choose forgiveness. I have seen faith expressed without microphones, platforms, or safety. This is not weakness, it is exposure, and exposure reveals truth. At the same time, I have seen what happens when the church, the world, and leadership fail to stand here. Darkness gains confidence, extremism refines its methods, indifference hardens into habit, and what is tested here begins to appear elsewhere, adapted to new languages and cultures. Do not deceive yourselves into thinking that this struggle is distant. The same forces that exploit poverty here exploit loneliness elsewhere. The same ideologies that weaponize faith here will distort it wherever fear replaces meaning. The same indifference that ignores Africa today will ignore another suffering tomorrow. Africa is not warning the world with words, it is warning it with consequences. When moral courage collapses here, the world learns that it can collapse anywhere. When faith survives here, the world is reminded that it still can. This is why I speak not only to Africans but to Christians and believers everywhere. What happens on this continent is a mirror. It reflects the state of global conscience more clearly than any speech or summit. If the church cannot stand where faith is costly, it will eventually fail where faith is comfortable. If believers cannot defend the dignity of the poor here, they will lose the ability to recognize injustice anywhere. Africa is not asking to be romanticized. It is asking to be recognized as a place where the battle between light and darkness is not theoretical. It is lived daily, quietly, and often alone. If the world turns away from this front line, it does not secure peace. It postpones responsibility, and postponed responsibility always returns with greater cost. This is my sixth warning. Africa is not the edge of the story. It is the center of a test that will shape the soul of this century. Whether the world stands here or abandons it will determine not only Africa's future but its own. As I bring these warnings to a close, I do not claim relief. Speaking truth does not lighten the burden, it sharpens it. But silence would have been heavier still. I do not pretend that these words will change the world overnight. I know how slowly conscience moves, and how quickly comfort resists disruption. Yet I also know that history is altered not only by armies and laws, but by moments when people choose to see clearly. I have shared these reflections not to condemn anyone, but to invite responsibility back into faith, not as guilt, but as love that refuses to remain passive. Love that understands that belief without action eventually empties itself of meaning. I wish peace for the world. I wish peace for Africa. I wish peace for Burkina Faso, for its children, for its elders, for its believers of every tradition. But peace is not the absence of conflict alone. It is the presence of justice, dignity, and courage, and those things do not arrive on their own. I have learned that evil rarely begins with hatred. It begins with indifference, with small compromises, with the decision to look away because the cost of looking feels too high. Yet every generation is judged by what it chooses to normalize. I ask those who hear these words to examine their own hearts gently, but honestly, not to ask what others should do, but what faith requires of them personally. Where silence has replaced compassion, where fear has replaced truth, where prayer has replaced responsibility instead of guiding it, Turning away from darkness does not require perfection. It requires direction. It requires choosing, again and again, to align belief with conscience. To reject violence even when it is justified loudly. To protect the vulnerable even when they are far away. To teach the young that goodness is not weakness and restraint is not surrender. I still believe in redemption. I believe societies can change. I believe faith can heal rather than divide. I believe Africa's story does not end in blood or despair. But belief alone is not enough. It must be carried by choices that cost something. To those who feel overwhelmed, I say this: you are not asked to carry the entire world. You are asked to refuse indifference where you stand. To remember names instead of numbers. To let suffering interrupt comfort. To allow faith to challenge habits rather than decorate them. To those who feel defensive, I offer no accusation, only a mirror. We all must decide what kind of believers we are becoming in an age that tests sincerity. I do not know what history will say about our time, but I know what it will ask. It will ask whether we noticed, whether we cared, whether we acted while there was still space to choose differently. Every morning I wake with the same awareness. Leadership does not grant clarity, it demands it, and conscience does not retire. Each day I rise and must choose again. There is no final victory, only vigilance or surrender. If these words have stirred something in you, do not let that stirring pass quietly. Reflection is the beginning of responsibility. Conversation is the beginning of accountability. And shared attention is the beginning of change. Those who listen, who reflect, who return to these questions are not spectators. They are participants in shaping what faith will mean in the years ahead. I leave you with hope, not because hope is easy, but because despair would be dishonest. The path forward is narrow, but it exists. And it begins wherever someone decides that silence will no longer be their answer. Each day I wake and must choose again. There is no final victory, only vigilance or surrender. May we choose vigilance, may we choose compassion with courage, and may we never forget that faith, when it is real, always asks something of us in return.